So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, everyone. We are still doing Tafseer Surah Al-An'am, and certainly yesterday we actually spent pretty much the whole hour or two on this ayah. وَمَا الْحَيَاةُ الدُّنْيَا إِلَّا لَعِبٌ وَلَهْوٌ وَلَلدَّارُ الْآخِرَةُ خَيْرٌ لِلَّذِينَ يَتَّقُونَ أَفَلَا تَعْقِلُونَ. And we talked about the psychology of a believer and how it's completely different from a psychology of a disbeliever. A psychology of disbeliever considers and basically sees this dunya as nothing but a place of entertainment and a place of a play. But a psychology of a believer is completely different because the psychology of a believer, they're living in taqwa, they're living in fear, and that fear of akhirah is what drives them in this dunya to stay committed to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to stay committed to the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to stay committed with their deen. Now, when I looked at that, yeah, I did actually go in so many different ways to explain the psychology of both, but then I don't know why I missed this hadith. In this hadith, the Prophet ﷺ actually said, here's the quote, okay, وَعِزَّتِي لا أجمع على عبدي خوفين ولا أجمع له أمنين إذا أمنني في الدنيا أخفته يوم القيامة وإذا خافني في الدنيا أمنته يوم القيامة. I want you to look at this one. So the Prophet ﷺ said in this hadith, and this hadith is actually called a hadith Qudusi. What does a hadith Qudusi mean? A hadith Qudusi actually means the wording is by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but the quote, the Prophet ﷺ quoted off Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He said, by my honor, I will not combine on my servants two fears and two securities. If this servant fears me in this life, if this person is feeling secure of me in this life, they would be scared on Judgment Day. And if they were to fear me in this life, they would be secure and safe on Judgment Day. In this hadith, it went right on with interpreting that ayah. You look at this hadith, it's basically telling us, well, you won't be scared in this life and the hereafter. And you won't be feeling safe in this life and the hereafter. But if you were to really feel safe in this life, and in other words, just enjoy your life as if there's no akhirah, then on Judgment Day, you will be afraid. And if you feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this dunya, on Judgment Day, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises that you will be safe. And this is extremely important because when we're speaking about fear, okay, the Prophet ﷺ had actually mentioned fear in different ways. When we're speaking about fear, there's a type of fear where the person is actually taking consideration Yawm al-Qiyamah. So what they live in is basically that moment to connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In that moment, when they connect to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they're not necessarily just living some kind of a joy and some kind of entertainment. No, they're taking their matters seriously. So when you look at fear, and that's that fear that basically lets the believer just focus on akhirah, and then that would drive them to taking their religion seriously. That would drive them to taking their faith and taking the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala seriously. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the ayah said, إِنَّمَا ذَلِكُمُ الشَّيْطَانُ يُخَوِّفُ أَوْلِيَاءَهُ فَلَا تَخَافُوهُمْ وَخَافُونِ إِن كُنتُم مُؤْمِنِينَ. Shaitan is going to use a different kind of a fear. If you don't do what I tell you, if you don't do what I guess they're telling you, people are going to laugh at you. You're not going to get anywhere. You're not going to get a good CV. You're not going to get the credit. People wouldn't want to be friends with you. You're going to be an outcast, and all these different things that Shaitan will be spewing within your brain to make you afraid of losing friends, losing status, losing money, losing credits. And of course, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that shaitan will use this method, يُخَوِّفُ أَوْلِيَاءَهُ, to basically get you scared. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, don't be afraid. Why? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants you to be mu'min. He wants you to be mu'min, whether mu'min means to feel secure or whether mu'min means to feel safe and to feel, or to be a believer. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, khafuni, just fear me, but don't be afraid of them. Because the fear that they're putting at your face is actually a mirage. They don't have the power to change anything about your provision, anything about your life, anything about your status. So don't be afraid of them. They do not really have the power to change anything about your life. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, أُولَٰئِكَ يُسَارِعُونَ فِي الْخَيْرَاتِ. So you would see them rushing to doing what is good because they're not afraid of shayateen. They're not afraid of those people that are telling them that if they don't do it their way, that they're not going to make their credits, they're not going to make it to probably their money, they're not going to make it into a lot of different things. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلِمَنْ خَافَ مَقَامَ رَبِّهِ جَنَّتًا. And whoever fears the position and the path of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would be getting two Jannahs. I want to look at this one because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is emphasizing that there is a fear, but that fear is only the fear of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that's going to really make a serious thing and a real thing. And that's why in the hadith, the Prophet ﷺ had actually talked about the believers, and he said that man khafa adlaj, whoever is really living the fear, you would find them waking up in the middle of the night, and they would basically take that moment to wake up in the middle of the night in order to do that qiyam al-layl when everyone else is asleep. They woke up in the middle of the night. Why did you wake up? They were feeling the fear. They were thinking of Yawm al-Qiyamah. They were thinking of Akhirah. And then they would wake up, and that would motivate them to just do 2 rak'ahs and wake up in the middle of the night in order to basically stand for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala on Judgment Day, in order to stand for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and get the security on Judgment Day. Man khafa adlaj. If they really feared Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you'll see them waking up during the night just to stand up for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and doing that that qiyam. Now here is something. This is something I wanted to say. He said, ليس الخائف الذي يبكي ويمسح عينيه بل من يترك ما يخاف أن يعاقب عليه. I want you to look at this one because some would think that it's an issue of just standing up and standing for salah and then doing what? Oh, here it is, I'm crying. So here he said, الحكماء. Well, just say some of the wise ones, the scholars that looked into these ayat and these ahadith, and they said, quote, the true person that is living the fear / taqwa is not the person that would cry and have tears and wipe his tears, but the person that would leave and abstain from what they would be afraid of what they would be held accountable for. In other words, It's not an issue of just crying for the sake of crying, but it's an issue of the person actually letting that motivate them to taking a real serious step of action. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّمَا يَخْشَى اللَّهَ مِنْ عِبَادِهِ الْعُلَمَاء, that the true scholars, that the true people that would know Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are the ones that would really have their hearts tremble. And that's why the Prophet ﷺ, in the hadith, he said, لو تعلمون ما أعلم لضحكتم قليلا ولبكيتم كثيرا وما تلذذتم بالنساء على الفرش ولخرجتم إلى الصعدة تجأرون إلى الله. He said, the Prophet ﷺ said, if you were to have known what I know, you would have laughed, barely laughed, and you would have cried so much, and you would not have enjoyed the women on the beds, in other words, and would not have been in relationship with even your wives, and you would have went out in the fields just with your voices, just calling on to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and just asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to give you that security. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described وَالَّذِينَ يُؤْتُونَ مَا أَتَوْا وَقُلُوبُهُمْ وَجِلَةٌ, and the ones that would come to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala because of what they had committed and their hearts trembling of fear. Sayyidah Aisha asked, O Prophet of Allah, is this actually referring to the people that had committed a sin, and therefore this is involving them? And the Prophet ﷺ said, La ya bint as-Siddiq, no, the daughter of a Siddiq, which is because she's the daughter of Bakr as-Siddiq. He said, they're actually the people that would be fasting, that would be praying and donating, but they would be afraid that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might not have accepted it from them. And that's important to keep in mind, that it's not an issue of, well, I never committed a major sin, never did zina, never did stealing, never did any major sin. But here you could see that the Prophet ﷺ said, no, وَقُلُوبُهُمْ وَجِلَةٌ, that would involve even those that would take the time to pray, make qiyam al-layl, and probably fast and donate and do all the things, but then they're afraid, maybe I wasn't doing it good enough. Maybe I wasn't sincere enough. Maybe I don't deserve to be accepted because maybe of a sin that I probably had forgotten and didn't necessarily remember to ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness from it. So this is extremely important to just learn the parameters of fear. And when we talked about fear yesterday, yes, we talked a lot about different things, but then I thought it was really important to mention these texts right there. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, أَمْ حَسِبَ الَّذِينَ اجْتَرَحُوا السَّيِّئَاتِ أَن نَجْعَلَهُمْ كَالَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ سَوَاءً مَحْيَاهُمْ وَمَمَاتُهُم سَاءَ مَا يَحْكُمُونَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, did the people that had transgressed and committed the sin, did they think that they would be equal to those that are believers and have done well, whether during their life or whether during their death? In other words, it's not equal. It's not equal. If you live this commitment in this dunya, then you're going to be living in fear in this dunya. And that's what's going to give you on Judgment Day the security on Yawm al-Qiyamah, that you would not be in fear of hellfire and punishment. All right, so the other thing that I wanted to talk about was basically this ayah. Let's see. قَدْ نَعْلَمُ إِنَّهُ لَيَحْزُنُكَ الَّذِي يَقُولُونَ. I want you to look at this ayah. There's so much to say in regards to this ayah, so we're just going to take a couple of things. قَدْ نَعْلَمُ إِنَّهُ لَيَحْزُنُكَ الَّذِي يَقُولُونَ فإنهم لا يكذبونك ولكن الظالمين بآيات الله يجحدون ولقد كذبت رسل من قبلك فصبروا على ما كذبوا وأوذوا حتى أتاهم نصرنا ولا مبدل لكلمات الله ولقد جاءك من نبأ المرسلين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, we know that you are saddened by what they were telling you, for they're not denying you, but the oppressors are actually denying the words of the Lord Almighty, and they would be in a state of juhud. What is the state of juhud? The state of juhud contains a couple things. Number one is denial. Number two, that denial takes that person into living a specific psychology. And that psychology is the psychology of not recognizing the good that surrounds them. In other words, they won't recognize the good, they won't even feel it, and they would be living in a world, in a psychology of anxiety. وَلَقَدْ كُذِّبَتْ رُسُلٌ مِّن قَبْلِكَ فَصَبَرُوا عَلَى مَا كُذِّبُوا. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling the Prophet, well, there were nations before you. They were actually denied as well. They were tortured as well. But those prophets, they endured the patience, and despite all the denial that they had received, they had just continued to wait because they were certain of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's victory. And there's no change in the words of Allah Almighty. And you know, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَكَ مِن نَبَإِ الْمُرْسَلِينَ. And you know now that with this information that was sent on to you from the Quran, you know some of the history of those prophets and what happened to them. Now, I thought it would be good because if you look at that ayah, it basically continues to say, وَإِن كَبُرَ عَلَيْكَ إِعْرَاضُهُم. If their turning away was just something that you felt that it was just, the word is kabura. Kabura means if something is really big. In other words, the Prophet ﷺ was living a psychology that he was feeling that there was a burden. And that burden, why did they reject? Why did they refuse to believe when all the evidences was basically laid out for them? And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was responding to the Prophet ﷺ. فَإِنِ اسْتَطَعْتَ أَن تَبْتَغِيَ نَفَقًا فِي الْأَرْضِ أَوْ سُلَّمًا فِي السَّمَاءِ فَتَأْتِيَهُمْ بِآيَةٍ. If you were capable, and even if you had come in or come with ayat from burrows deep in the earth, or whether you had put in some ladder and stairway to the heavens and bring them each and every single verse and every single miracle, did the ayah say what they would be doing? It didn't. Because this ayah is saying, well, I recognize that you are really feeling burdened by their lack of recognition and by their denial. But I want you to know that it's not an issue of what miracle is presented. It's not an issue of what argument you probably were looking for, this magical argument that's going to change and redirect their vision and redirect their understanding. And that's why the ayah said, there are some people, even if you were to somehow dig a hole in the ground and a burrow in the ground and somehow go deep underneath you, or whether if you were to go really up in the heavens and let them see right there that you're getting the ayat with a ladder, whether deep in the ground or up high in the heavens, in other words, up and down, they're still not going to accept it. Why? Because they're not looking for truth. They're looking to live a delusion because they are enjoying their dunya. They're just enjoying their dunya, that they don't want to know that there's an akhirah. It's exactly like when you would come to a person, you start telling them about death, and they would be like, oh, come on, don't ruin our joy and tell us about death. But that's a reality. We have to remember al-akhirah. We have to, and Umar ibn al-Khattab, was it Umar ibn al-Khattab? Forgot. Was it Umar ibn al-Khattab where the Prophet ﷺ كَفَى بِالْمَوْتِ وَاعِظًا, that al-maut is an enough reminder and enough reminder for us to just think about in order to give us that reminder. So then the ayah continues, وَلَوْ شَاءَ اللَّهُ لَجَمَعَهُمْ عَلَى الْهُدَى. If the Lord Almighty wanted them to be in faith, He would have actually combined them and made them not have the free will to choose but submission to the Lord Almighty. And He said, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. So don't be amongst the jahilin. Wait a minute. What's a jahil? Why is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala telling the Prophet ﷺ, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ? How do we understand this? And then that's why I thought it would be a good idea to share this good article. And remember, let's see where this article is for you to see it. It's a really good article that was in this in this magazine. This is actually a magazine, an Islamic magazine. Okay, wanted to share it because this article was beautifully written. And let's see, well, what is it talking about anyways? So this article is talking about the word al-jahl in the Quran. What is the word al-jahl? So jahila, actually, here's the root, jahila. I'm just going to highlight the root, the actual root itself is basically the red one. Okay, that's jahila. The word jahila basically means to be ignorant of something. What does it mean to be ignorant of something? This would be basically that you're unaware of it, you're in in total ignorance about this matter. Now, when you look at this, at least this ayah that we were doing, it said, إِنِّي أَعِظُكَ أَن تَكُونَ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. But here's one thing. When you look at the word jahl, this is another website right there. And I loved how this encyclopedia of Quran, it basically just laid out the word jahila and the word jahil in Quran and said, well, the word jahil in Quran could sometimes come in as basically the antonym to knowledge. Basically ignorance. So just like in this ayah, الفقراء الذين أحصروا في سبيل الله لا يستطيعون ضربا في الأرض, and then here it would say that لا يسألون or تعرفهم where is it يحسبهم الجاهل أغنياء من التعفف, that a person that is unaware, that is ignorant about the real situation that they're living in, their financial status, they would think that these people are actually well maintained, at least financially. And they would have no clue that these people are actually way behind their completing or at least getting their financial state in place. So that's the first meaning. The opposite of ilm. Just like in another ayah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّمَا التَّوْبَةُ عَلَى اللَّهِ لِلَّذِينَ يَعْمَلُونَ السُّوءَ بِجَهَالَةٍ. The real tawbah, that repentance that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would basically accept are those that would commit a sin bijahala, in ignorance. They probably didn't know, or at that moment they probably lost their vision of faith, and then they committed the sin, and then they regret it. ثُمَّ يَتُوبُونَ. Then they would ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for forgiveness. They would repent to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Okay, now the second meaning, you could see it's a number of different ayat, but let's see. The second meaning of jahl is the antonym of Islam. And this is important to keep in mind because we're trying to right there scrutinize that ayah when it was telling the Prophet ﷺ and Prophet Nuh alayhi salam and even Prophet Musa and Prophet Yusuf, there was this correlation to say, well, don't be from al-jahilin. The question is, did the Prophet ﷺ actually commit jahl? Why would he tell him, don't be from al-jahilin? So that's why we're laying out these meanings of jahl to make sure we understand things correctly. We understand the wording correctly. That's why we would go back to the different ayat and see what the word jahl in the Quran had appeared in different forms and different meanings in the Quran. So that's why we're looking at those different forms and different meanings. The second one, or is this a third? Basically, Jahiliyyah, to me, the opposition of Islam, and that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned, يَظُنُّونَ بِاللَّهِ غَيْرَ الْحَقِّ ظَنَّ الْجَاهِلِيَّة. They would think of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they would believe about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the same belief as the Jahiliyyah slash, meaning what was before the prophetic era, meaning the same faith that is in opposition and basically opposing the faith of Islam. So then we would recognize, well, one, the opposition of Islam is called Jahiliyyah, and certainly the antonym of Islam is called Jahiliyyah. And also, sometimes you could see أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ, and this is important because when we speak about an idea, in other words, we're speaking about a creed. The creed itself can be called Jahiliyyah, but it's not exclusive to creed because legislation is also included as well. Which is why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had indicated, أَفَحُكْمَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ يَبْغُونَ, are they seeking the rulings of al-Jahiliyyah? Now, this is important because we cannot separate legislation from creed. Islam is coming from two sides, legislation and creed. What do they both mean? So creed would basically, الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, and legislation, عاملوا الصالحات, and do what is righteous. So amanu is in relationship to what you believe about Allah, what you believe about the hereafter, what you believe about the Quran, about the prophets, etc., the unseen. All of that is related to creed. Okay. Now, legislation is your definition of justice, your definition of human rights, your definition of people's roles, social rules, financial rights, international law, whatever, all these different things, that's basically supposed to be based and stemming from Islam. So if the person is taking their definition of justice, their definition of what they would consider human rights or whatever it is in laws outside of Islam, then in that situation, they would be ruling by Jahiliyyah. It's pretty ironic that, of course, the West is taking Sayyid Qutb as the leading figure for terror because he basically said, well, al-Hakimiyya is for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In that book, it was translated into Milestones and Ma'alim fi al-Tariq al-Arabiyya. And certainly, they really went off track because that's every Muslim. It's not just Sayyid Qutb. Every Muslim basically considers that believing in Islam is not just an issue of taking the faith as relating to creed and what you believe about Judgment Day and what you believe about this life and the hereafter, but it's actually putting it into practice by putting the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala into practice. So that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in terms of actions, he was also recommending for the Prophet ﷺ's wives, وَقَرْنَ فِي بُيُوتِكُنْ وَلَا تَبَرَّجْنَ تَبَرُّجَ الْجَاهِلِيَّةِ الْأُولَى. There's definitely the big, let's say, foundation legislation, and that's recognizing that foundation. And there are the details of Islam. There are the details of legislation, and that's what I wanted to talk about as well in that in this article right there. But first, I wanted to kind of give you like a prelude, break it down before we go in all the details. وَقَرْنَ فِي بُيُوتِكُنْ, and stay in your homes and dwell in your homes and do not expose your beautification or your basically the different cosmetics that you might be putting to make it the practice of al-jahiliyyah al-ula and make it similar to the practice of the pre-prophetic era, meaning that a person can be Muslim and actually practicing jahiliyyah without them knowing. And this is important to keep in mind, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is saying that yes, some jahiliyyah can be defined as disbelief, and then there could be a jahiliyyah where Muslims themselves, yes, they are practicing the principles of Allah, but sometimes they would get off track with certain other sins and perhaps practice jahiliyyah, whether it's in trying to blend in with the trend of a certain way of dressing or a certain way of attraction, or probably in their life matters and they want to live in a certain appearance, etc. That's jahiliyatil ula. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had mentioned different forms of this jahiliyyah. Some of it is in appearance. Other types of jahiliyyah is جعل الذين كفروا في قلوبهم الحمية حمية الجاهلية. In other situations, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, there could be different forms of jahil. The other type of jahil is when people would have this type of patriotism. What does that mean? So it's kind of like they would be supporting their own blood and supporting their own tribe. And this person is like, yeah, well, I'm from this country and this country is better. And these people from the other country, they're worse, they're ignorant, they're this. And of course, without them realizing, they're actually practicing this jahiliyyah, thinking that they are better simply because of their lineage, simply because the probably nationality or their blood, or probably because they come from a certain tribe or whatever it is. And that's hamiyat al-jahiliyyah. That's basically that ignorance, to not realize and really see that people's status is not based on lineage. It's not based on nationality, but it's actually based on taqwa. It's redefining people's status and redefining the importance and what really makes a person of value. It's not the money, because that looking at it from that angle is jahiliyyah. It's not your lineage, because looking at it from that status is jahiliyyah. It's not the status they probably might have in perhaps in even degrees. That's not what actually marks that status. Sorry, but the cat wants to drink water and it refuses to drink water from its own bowl. I have to open up the tap for it. So let's give it a second. Let's يرحمها. You have to be merciful on the cat. And my cat does not like drinking water from his little bowl. No, he likes fresh water from the tap. So I have to respect it. Okay, now let's look at the other piece of translation, or at least let's say al-jahl sometimes is also, according to the Quran, could also be speaking about a certain instinct, speaking about a certain behavior that a person might be engaged in. In other words, it's part of your nature as a human being. So what does that look like? That basically comes into in this ayah, إِنَّا عَرَضْنَا الْأَمَانَةَ عَلَى السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ وَالْجِبَالِ فأبين أن يحملنها وأشفقن منها وحملها الإنسان. But the part that we are basically wanting to focus on, حملها الإنسان, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the human psychology as إنه كان ظلوما جهولا. What does it describe as the human psychology? That it is ظلوما. What is ظلوما? ظلوما means that the person has the tendency to basically transgress the limit. Because a dhulm is mujawazat al-had, is going beyond the limit. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes the human being as having the tendency, and it's part of their own nature, that they would transgress the limit. They don't know how to stick to a limit. They're going to keep on trying to go farther and farther and trespass certain boundaries. Even if you were to give them a boundary, they'll have the tendency to go further and further, whether it's in search of security or in search of a reward or in search of dopamine or in search of entertainment or whatever it is, in search of different things, or as well, jahula. Why would they be in search of any of this? And this is something to tell the teenagers, especially the teenagers, they would be falling in, I would say, stronger in this level of jahl because they would have a stronger built-in, let's call it, tendency for curiosity. And curiosity, remember, is not always good. I know the education systems, like for the curiosity, yeah, you can try it, you can try experience and experiment just different things, etc. But you want to keep in mind, Prophet Adam alayhi salam, his curiosity was motivated by one. Iblis comes to him and said, أَوَلَا أَدُلُّكَ عَلَى شَجَرَةِ الْخُلْدِ وَمُلْكٍ لَا يَبْلَى. What was Iblis's recommendation and suggestion? He said, I'm just going to show you off to a tree. Let me turn off the water. I'll come back. If you look at Prophet Adam, his curiosity was motivated by Iblis, and he said, أَوَلَا أَدُلُّكَ عَلَى شَجَرَةِ الْخُلْدِ. Do you not want me to show you off to a tree that will give you the ability to live eternally? And mulkin la yabla, and this type of ownership that it's going to expand farther than your current wealth, your current ownership, your current property. You're going to contain a lot more than what you had thought. And that's that curiosity that pushed him. Will I really get this type of promising status? Will I really, if I were to eat from this tree, it looks rewarding that perhaps it really has shajaratul khuld. Maybe it has the treatment to death. Maybe it has what I would need to keep me strong, healthy, fit. And well, you want to keep that in mind, that a lot of the different things that you would be seeing, whether it's in cosmetics or whether it's in a lot of the products that are sold to you, are they're telling you, well, it's going to make you look attractive. You take this and it's going to give you a six-pack. You take this, it's going to make your lips just look outstanding. It's going to make you fit in. And I want to say that I would get a lot of women calling me and asking me, I feel so insecure about my, and then you could, fill in the blank about what they're feeling insecure about. It's not gonna end at one thing, by the way. And it's gonna fill a blank, 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 blank. You're gonna have so many blanks, and she's always going to feel insecure about her appearance. And she would ask, is it permissible for me to do this surgery or this Botox or the filling or whatever it is, and all these different things? Why? Because it's actually causing me anxiety. And I would say, well, the anxiety is not caused by the appearance. Unless you really had a deformity, that's the only time that you could actually do that surgery. But other than that, to somehow just look for security, security is not by whatever you're building onto your body and how people are going to think that you're so good looking, etc. Because security is within. Security is within. And that's that area that Adam alayhi salam thought that if he was going to be eating from the tree, that he would probably and may even have the secret to longevity, to long living life and living eternally, being healthy, probably getting stronger. He thought that by trespassing the boundary that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had set, that it's probably the secret to happiness. The secret to happiness by one, probably getting stronger, two, probably having more wealth. And if you look at a lot of the different haram things are actually coming with these two motives. The motive to appear fitter, stronger, get more attraction and social acceptance. And then the second one is to basically get more in containing things in this life. And you want to keep that one in mind, that that's actually part of my instinct, your instinct, and every single human being's instinct, that they are ظلوما جهولا, that they're actually living this drive, unaware of the reality of the world around them. So sometimes their curiosity can go wrong and can actually put them on a slippery slope, and without them realizing, taking them into a completely different area. And that's the instinct of a human being. ظلوما. They would be transgressing the limit. They don't know how to stop. They cannot stop. And that's why they need that taqwa to give them that break, to give them that break, to hold them from this type of an acceleration, basically becoming something beyond their ability to control. Can it happen? It can happen. That's what ظلومة means. Jahula, ignorant about the reality and the true things that happen around them. Let's see. The other thing is that it was just like when it talked about, if I were the person to write this article, well, I mean, this is not an article. This one's something else. But so, if you were to look at the other meanings for al-jahl in the Quran, any behavior that is basically a behavior that is away from the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is basically described as jahl. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had said in regards to Prophet Musa alayhi salam and basically Bani Israel, not in regards to Musa alayhi salam, قال أعوذ بالله أن أكون من الجاهلين. Prophet Musa alayhi salam describing the behavior of his people when he ordered them to slaughter a cow, and then they said, أتتخذنا هزوا? Are you here really, mocking us? And you're not, are you here just not taking us seriously? Or are you here like pranking us? And he said, I want you to look at this one, because they actually thought it was somewhat of a prank, somewhat just a joke. And did they really think that it was a joke? They knew he was a prophet, so they knew very well that he has no time for joking and that this is a serious matter. And this is important to keep in mind, that many would take the religion as a place of la'ib and lahu, not taking it seriously. So they would be, for example, might be praying and laughing, or probably pinching the person next to him, or probably wearing the hijab and making jokes about hijab and jokes about niqab and jokes about this. This is actually a form of jahiliyyah. And guess what? In fact, to make jokes about hijab or make jokes about salah, it could actually put the person in kufr, and not only in sin. Because when you go and look back at Surah Al-Tawbah, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described the people that had mocked the believers. They didn't even mock the Quran. They didn't mock the Prophet ﷺ. They mocked the believers. And they said, they're the ones that join on jihad. They're the most ones to basically be the most coward ones. They're the most ones to basically eat the most. They're the ones to the ones to be the latest in joining the army and etc. But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described that what they were saying, their inference was not at all to mock but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and Islam. So for those that would mock or think of Islam or think of the principles of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or mock maybe the beard or mock hijab or anything like that, if they would think, well, I'm still a Muslim, you just committed. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said that they just committed and called them لا تعتذروا قد كفرتم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said you had just committed disbelief right there. Mocking anything about the religion is actually nothing but a sign that reflects that the person is not taking the religion seriously. And Prophet Musa alayhi salam said, "A'udhu billahi an akuna min al-jahilin." I seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to be amongst the jahilin. What is the jahilin? To actually think that the religion is not to be taken seriously. We're probably talking about a halaqah and they would be cracking jokes in the middle of the halaqah. It's like, what's the joke for? This is jahiliyyah. What's the joke for? What's so funny about this? And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. Same thing that you could say, أعوذ بالله أن أكون من الجاهلين فلا تكونن من الجاهلين. Basically, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, which is the ayah that we were doing, if you are basically feeling that burden that they would be turning away from you, etc. We just talked about this ayah, فلا تكونن من الجاهلين. This is to mean not that the Prophet ﷺ was living jahiliyyah, because the ayah did not call him jahil, but the ayah was saying, do not be from them. In other words, the way that you would view this world is, well, why aren't they believers? And you put in the effort, but then they're still rejecting, and then you're unaware. And that's that unawareness that sometimes one doesn't recognize that there are certain things that you just have to know, that this world moves on and that you can't really control everything. And that's when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. There are certain things, yes, you would feel sorry for maybe the children making the wrong choices. You would probably feel sorry for people not accepting and embracing Islam. You would feel certain things. Yes, it's part of faith that you would feel that faith, but feel that sentiment. It's part of faith that you're sad that people are actually embracing disbelief, but you're not going to fake it. And at the same time, don't let it control you to a level that it would take you into living in anxiety and depression. And that's jahiliyyah. Okay? That would be when a person is not recognizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world, and basically what you see is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala being in control. At the end, He gave them the free will. They would have to take the responsibility of the choices that they would be making, but don't let that be that severe depression that would overcome your ability to move on. That's that depression. Don't let it overcome your ability to move on. You got to live it within a certain amount of recognition, the reality that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world in, which is He gave them the free will. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had basically created this world to test the people. And then at the end, don't let their turning away choices overcome your ability to move on. And that's that area. Depression can sometimes be a sign of jahiliyyah, not always, but sometimes it can be a sign of jahiliyyah if the person is not putting a limit to it. And how can they not put a limit to it? Sometimes the person can get carried away with their feelings, perhaps feeling too sorry about someone, or perhaps feeling too angry about a certain lifestyle that they had lived in, or probably feeling so angry about an abuse that they had lived. And that's when we would say, wait a minute, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. Don't let that, whether it's an abuse or a toxic relationship or whatever hardship you went through, don't let it overcome you. So does that mean I'm losing faith by having depression and all of that? Well, let's just say you're on the borders of not recognizing that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala as the one that is al-adil, as the one that is the most just, that He will compensate you. So don't live absorbed by all of this transgression that happened to you, but all of this sorrow or probably pain or whatever it is, don't let that overcome you, because your understanding and your faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a key thing to help you remember that this will not be forever, and that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one that basically will give the compensation, or Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one to give hidayah, because we're not just talking about compensation here, because in this ayah, we're actually talking about hidayah as well. So don't let it overcome you by probably disabling you from living your dunya, living your akhirah, and probably getting things done. And you had different cases, and we talked before about Al-Ghazali, and how he had himself lived a moment of that severe depression, but the depression that he was living in, it was more of doubt. And what doubt? Did he doubt the faith of Islam? No, he didn't doubt the faith of Islam. So what did he doubt? He was looking for the resources. How do I understand the epistemology? How do I understand the resources of knowledge? How do I define what would make a valid resource? And then he continued to search, and in fact, he was actually the head of a Nizamiya school in Baghdad. The head of Nizamiya school, and he basically had all the keys for different knowledge, basically ilm al-fiqh, ilm al-aqeedah, the science of aqeedah, the science of usul al-fiqh. In fact, he had already written a number of different books before that, but he still found that there's something that I cannot figure out. So he goes to Palestine, and for 4 years, resigns from a Nizamiya school, goes to Palestine, and for 4 years, he's just confined really in his place and just thinking about answers to these questions. And then in the end, in his book, he called it al-Munqidh min al-Dalal. In his book, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, the word Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, the book is in about almost 220 pages, give and take. Okay. And the book, Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal, it's basically translated into the one to protect you from misguidance. Okay. In his book, he basically talks about his journey. And other scholars, they said it wasn't that that book is not talking about his journey as much as laying out his, I guess, his ideas to help the reader understand a point. So it's kind of like when you write a dissertation, you would put in all these questions in the beginning. But the truth of the matter is that later, of course, when you're done with your dissertation, you would go back to the introduction again and rewrite the introduction with these questions. Even though like the introduction was the last thing that you had written, it would seem that it was the first thing that was written, but that's in order to bring in, I guess, this enthusiasm to continue reading. Okay, so was that what the main aim and the reason why Al-Munqidh min al-Dalal was coming in, as if it was Al-Ghazali himself going through the experience? So that's that debate that I'll just let it stay on a side. But then the main conclusion that Al-Ghazali reached was that you can lay out all the different arguments, but you can debate and debate. And you can go into so much skepticism and doubt and redoubting the resources and all of that. But at the end, all I could say is that Iman and faith is just نور قذفه الله في قلبي. It's the light that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had just sparked in my heart. And that spark of light, that takes me to the ayah that I frequently would quote, which is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِيَتَّبِعُونَ إِلَّا الظَّنَّ. They would follow speculation, وَمَا تَهْوَى الْأَنفُسِ, and what their heart and what they would desire, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى, when their Lord Almighty had sent them guidance. What is that to break down things for us? It's breaking down to tell us that different ways of finding Jahiliyyah could be in speculation as well. And وَمَا تَهْوَى الْأَنفُسِ. And many would think that by just following the experiences, their feelings, their desires, that's their way of finding the truth. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is also pointing out as Jahiliyyah as well. I would like to say that many would embrace the religion as an experiment. They would say, I tried wearing hijab, it wasn't for me. I tried keeping up with my prayer, it wasn't for me. That's experimenting the religion is the wrong way. You're using it the wrong way and thinking that somehow there's gonna spark one thing someday and that all of a sudden you recognize that it was for you. You're doing it the wrong way, dear. Because وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم مِّن رَبِّهِمُ الْهُدَى. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had sent the guidance in order for you to really get into that level of guidance, in order for you to really feel that spark of Iman. Oh, it takes a lot of experiment, experience, training, commitment, consistency. It doesn't just happen within a day. And that's what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَلَقَدْ جَاءَهُم. And for sure, certainly, they had received guidance from their Lord Almighty. Did they choose to believe it? Did they choose to embrace it? Did they choose to embrace guidance? Well, that's something that they would have to work, but for sure, and eventually, I would let them know, and they would know that the Lord Almighty had sent them the guidance. Now, and that's why when we look at the different types of jahil, you could see sometimes it's asking for things that are not rational, things that are not logical. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala basically talked about the people of Bani Israel, that they had come to some idol right there, and then they said, "Oh Musa, why don't you give us a god and a deity, just like they would have one? Look, they would have this deity that they could relate to. Can you give us a god instead of a god being so distant? Can we have a god that is nearby that we could relate to?" So that's when Prophet Musa alayhi salam said, قَالَ إِنَّكُمْ قَوْمٌ تَجْهَلُونَ. You're people that are تَجْهَلُون, meaning you're so irrational. You created a narrative and thought that this deity that they were worshiping, this idol that they were worshiping, was actually coming in as something that is near. I thought you would know that the Lord Almighty is anyways near, because your Lord Almighty is actually nearer to you because he was the one that had given you life. He's the one that gives you the provision. So he is near, but you don't have to create something that you feel physically. إنكم قوم تجهلون. You're so ignorant about the reality. You want to create a reality and think that by creating a reality that somehow this is real. You just created your own lie, and then you want to believe it. قال إنكم قوم تجهلون. The other definition of jahl in the Quran is basically not understanding the legal maxims or the reasons and the wisdoms behind the different rulings. And this is important. Sometimes we may not recognize why our loved one passed away, or why, despite the fact that I prayed Salat al-Istikhara, my marriage was a failure, or why I basically did not pass even though I studied this exam. Why this and why that? And they would live either looking at their own selves as being failures, or considering that it's Allah's fault that didn't make what they wanted to expect to happen, thinking that the Lord Almighty is an impulsive God, and that, hey, just like because by this person feeling that they want something to happen, and they really wanted it so bad that the impulsive Lord was going to just give them what they want. Thinking that, and this happens a lot, especially with women, because they would be feeling so emotionally so tensed about something, and they would feel so emotional about something that whenever they're living in such emotion, that they would feel that it has to happen. If not, that's when, and keep that one in mind, the Prophet ﷺ had described women as رَأَيْتُكُنَّ أَكْثَرَ أَهْلِ النَّارِ. I had seen majority of the people dwelling in hellfire are actually from women. Why? One asked. He said, تُكْثِرْنَ اللَّعْنَ. You're continuously complaining about things. تكفرن العشير. Whenever somebody contributes anything, gives you anything, or even if it's your husband, even if it's your father, you'll always consider yourself as a victim. Why? Because the mentality of that victim just wants us to accuse others of their responsibility to make a change, and not mine. It's easier to live as a victim than actually live as the one being guilty. And that I have to make the change, not others make the change for me. So then they would live this mentality of being victims, and then they would continue to complain about how everyone was just not living up to their standards, and how everybody was just transgressing the limits with them, etc. And this is basically lacking wisdom. So Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, basically, when he was doing dawah to his son, but then his son refused the dawah and said, I'll go to the highest mountain to protect me from the waves and those strong waves, and I'll be safe from the water, the rainwater, the waves, and etc. And I'm not going to go onto that ship. And then Prophet Nuh alayhi salam tells him, there's no way that you can run away from the punishment and the torments of the Lord Almighty. You have to ride with us to announce basically your commitment to faith. And this is how you put it into practice. But then, حال بينهم الموج. The waves, they grew so strong that eventually his son was basically covered and drowned by the wave. Prophet Nuh alayhi salam, like any other father, he basically said, Inna bini min ahli. My son, he's part of my family. But then, what did he want to say? Is there any way that I can probably intercede for him? But then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala respond, قال يا نوح إنه ليس من أهلك. Nuh, he's not part of your family. Because what makes family is not blood, it's faith. What makes the definition of that orbit that surrounds you and you consider it as part of you is faith. So I want you to see, إنه عمل غير صالح. The behavior that he had committed was not a pious behavior. فلا تسألني ما ليس لك به علم. Don't ask me of something that you have no knowledge of, and that's that area. There are certain things that the Lord Almighty had set as parameters and had set as reality and patterns in this life. Some will choose to live in faith, others will choose not to. Gave them the free will, etc. And he said, فَلَا تَسْأَلْنِ مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. You don't have knowledge in why, in the details of why this person, even if it's your own son, why they didn't deserve and didn't have the strong faith to jump into your ship. So what happens? He didn't jump into the ark. Why not? Because of some details that you don't really know about, all the details about your son. إِنِّي أَعِظُكَ أَن تَكُونَ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. For the Lord Almighty is warning you from observing matters from the lens of Jahiliyyah. Wait, the lens of Jahiliyyah, what does that mean? Lens of Jahiliyyah is basically the lens that does not recognize, at least in this context, that doesn't recognize the patterns that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created this world in. So, the lens of Jahiliyyah, thinking that, well, I mean, he appeared to be a good person. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, فَلَا تَسْأَلْنِي مَا لَيْسَ لَكَ بِهِ عِلْمٍ. You don't really know the reality of this person. They didn't deserve to be on that ark. They didn't deserve to be on with you because of certain details that you don't know of, and therefore he's going to get punished for things that you are unaware about him. So, فَلَا تَكُونَنَّ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. Then the ruling on this person or on others is not based on the relationship, blood relations, but is based off piety or not, religious integrity or not. That's the way that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would rule as justice. That's the way Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would rule that what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had just before even the creation of this world is one thing. وَالْعَمَلُ الصَّالِحُ يَرْفَعُ. The good action is what is going to elevate this person away from the torments of hellfire. Let's say another form of jahl in the Quran, that it would tell us that what would make jahiliyyah is that if a person practices something that is the opposite of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created as part of our instinct, and in particular, when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had described the people of Qawm Lut, he said, وَلُوطًا إِذْ قَالَ لِقَوْمِهِ أَتَأْتُونَ الْفَاحِشَةَ وَأَنْتُمْ تُبْصِرُونَ. Are you committing this sexual aberration when you are capable of seeing, in other words, you're capable of seeing the truth, you're capable of seeing and recognizing that this anatomy is different from that anatomy, you're capable of recognizing these are two different anatomies, you are capable of recognizing that there's something that is an input and something else is an output, they don't go together. But then, أَإِنَّكُمْ لَتَأْتُونَ الرِّجَالَ شَهْوَةً مِّن دُونِ النِّسَاءِ. You would approach men with lust and instead of women. What was it? Well, they were practicing that sexual aberration and gayism, basically. بَلْ أَنْتُمْ قَوْمٌ تَجْهَلُونَ. For you are people that are practicing that jahiliyyah. That's that word right there. Practicing that jahiliyyah, meaning that you are not actually being committed to what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created as something within the instinct or as something that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala created as a reality in this world. The other things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentioned the word al-jahiliyyah right there in a context of خُذِ الْعَفْوَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, well, now that you recognize, I want you, خُذِ الْعَفْوَ. Whenever there is basically a door to forgiving, in a door to embracing somebody's, I guess, pardon, and somebody is asking for forgiveness, خذ العفو, just forgive them, just move on. Why? Feels better to retaliate, doesn't it? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, actually, it doesn't. Because you would be thinking that you're turning off the fire of anger. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is telling you, what's actually better to turn off the fire of anger is by putting in a fire of feeling content. Fire does not turn off fire, it burns it. But if you were to bring in the water of content, the coolness of content, that's when the coolness will fill you as well. So he said, وَأْمُرْ بِالْعُرْفِ. In order for doing what is good, وَأَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. You order for what is good, you tried to support the truth within the society, but then people are turning away. Well, in the end, أَعْرِضْ عَنِ الْجَاهِلِينَ. In the end, you basically would have no choice but to turn away from those that would not embrace the truth, that would not basically want to follow the truth. At the end, you got to make a choice. That choice, after you had delivered the message and they still insisted that they don't want to, keep this line, a small connection between you and them, but then you would have to make a final determination at the end that no, some people, I don't belong within their orbit and they don't belong within my orbit either. Certain times you have to make these final decisions. I don't belong in their orbit, and neither do they belong in my orbit. Think of it, and I always say this. Remember, in chemistry, you've got, for example, the Ag would basically have certain orbits, and the silver, or whether we're speaking about Na, it would have a certain orbit, and all of that. Every single element would have an orbit and it would have a certain number of ions and whatever electrons and whatever it is, in that would define the definition and the character of that element. That's the same thing. The people that you surround yourself with, they're going to define your identity. They're going to define you, and you would have to define yourself as to you choosing and determining who is within your circle and who is not within your circle. Who is supposed to be as a person that I am friends with, and who's not supposed to be a person that I would hang out with. That's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, وَعِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ الَّذِينَ يَمْشُونَ عَلَى الْأَرْضِ هَوْنًا وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. عِبَادُ الرَّحْمَنِ. The servants of the Lord Almighty. Which one? Which name? Ar-Rahman, the one they're seeking mercy. So they're servants of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they walk on earth, hawna, they don't walk on earth with anxiety when they're collapsed onto the ground. No, they walk with hawna. They recognize that the Lord Almighty is taking care of all my matters. I have to put in a certain investment of probably, whether it's getting a job or whatever it is, but I know that it is from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So what are they doing? Even the psychology of a person is even affecting their gait, their walk, the way they would sit, the way they laugh, the way they would look at things. In every single corner, it's basically affecting them. And here Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talked about the way that they would walk. Why the way they would walk? This isn't metaphorical, but this is actually speaking about the way they would walk in order to show you that when these servants of the Lord Almighty, when faith had filled them, it didn't just fill them metaphorically, but it filled them to the point that you could recognize the way they walk. They would walk with consistency. They would walk with firmness. They would walk going to their destination, and they would walk in a way that reflects their commitment. And وَإِذَا خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ قَالُوا سَلَامًا. And when those people that basically are living in Jahiliyyah, probably mocking them, bullying them, or probably picking on them, talking about them in different ways, قَالُوا سَلَامًا. They're living in such strength. When they would walk, you would recognize their strength. And then when خَاطَبَهُمُ الْجَاهِلُونَ, when those ignorant people, they would come at them, they would just say, salam. They wouldn't even blink. Why? Because if every single dog that barks at you, you're going to get yourself busy to just get a rock and find a rock to throw it at them, you're never going to get to your destination. Ulama and true leaders, they don't just choose their followers and who they follow, but they even choose their enemies. Just keep that in mind, okay? They even choose their enemies. You wouldn't see that they're attacking this and, for example, this and that country. They will attack the countries that they recognize that by overcoming them, that's basically what happened. Pakistan, well, India actually attacked Pakistan, but then Pakistan was prepared. Boom, put them down. Then India went right behind everybody and basically went to the US. Can you tell them to stop? And they basically learned a lesson. You know what? Can you tell them to stop? And what happened? It's like, why did they go to the US? Because they were like, let's say that this is just an issue of a way of, let's get into peace, right? Yeah, so now you learned a lesson. Now you want to talk about peace. We'll talk about peace, but of course you can't build peace unless you recognize that the other person, and here, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala Rabbi protect the people of Pakistan, protect the Muslims in India as well. Because the Muslims in India, they're going through a lot as well. Okay, so now we recognize, moving on out of politics, وَإِذَا سَمِعُوا اللَّغْوَ أَعْرَضُوا عَنْهُ. For the believers, whenever they would hear al-laghu, trivial talk. Why? Because a believer is not a person that would engage in trivial talk. Why? Because a believer is a leader. Trivial talk is what the low-class people would follow. That's the era that we're living in, an era of consumption, an era of all that social media. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, they would أعرضوا عنه. They would turn away from it because it would not give them even a blink of an eye because they're living in that consistency. وَقَالُوا لَنَا أَعْمَالُنَا وَلَكُمْ أَعْمَالُكُمْ. You've got your path and your actions, and you're going to be held accountable for that. But don't necessarily think you're going to absorb me to getting into your trend, because Salamun alaykum. Peace be upon you. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give you peace. You're trying to seek peace, right? Well, you're definitely using the wrong method, because peace could only be attained through Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So they said, we're not going to be following the path of al-jahilin because we have a goal. That's a leader. We've got a goal. We don't waste our time responding to X and Y and Z, or even getting into that entertainment. And therefore, just realizing that when we're speaking about il-jahl, how do I understand the parameters of jahl? Number one, we were just talking about that, all those different words in the Quran. But then I liked about this article is that it would give me, I guess, different meanings that the other, well, that one, the one before it wasn't an article. This page was actually, let's say, it is al-Mawsu'a al-Qur'aniyya. It's more like an encyclopedia for the Quran. Okay. And then you would put in a certain word, and you actually have it even in your Quran. Okay. You would have it at the end of your Quran, and they would have these colored, kind of like a glossary. That's basically what it is. So we basically just went into the word jahiliyyah based on that. But then there's, there are a couple things that, of course, we would have to also scrutinize. Al-jahl could be, one, any form of speech that a person might say that is not true about the Lord Almighty. Two, believing in something that is a delusion and not really the reality of what it is. Number three, basically jahiliyyah could also be referred to sin. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, إِنَّمَا التَّوْبَةُ عَلَى اللَّهِ لِلَّذِينَ يَعْمَلُونَ السُّوءَ بِجَهَالَةٍ. Those that would commit sin. السُّوءَ بِجَهَالَةٍ is not that they didn't know that that was a sin. No, because if a person commits a sin and they didn't know that that was a sin, that wouldn't be a sin. They wouldn't be held accountable for it. Okay. But يعملون السوء بجهالة, they, in that moment, they basically committed that sin. In that moment, their faith's just, just like in the hadith where the Prophet ﷺ actually said that لا يزني الزاني وهو مؤمن. A person, when they would commit zina, they're not committing it in the state of iman. What, they went into kufr at that moment? No, it's not that they went into kufr at that moment. It's that their brain and their heart was so pacified into and focusing on the la'ib and lahu that they lost that moment when their heart was connected to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The fear just turned off for a second, or for that moment when they had committed that ma'asiyah, that sin. And jahiliyyah could also be referring to al-hidayah wal-dalal bi-mashi'atillah. So we're talking about basically al-jahiliyyah could be referring to a delusion and going away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Jahiliyyah, the opposite of knowledge. Jahiliyyah, basically the opposite of truth. Jahiliyyah, basically doing something that the person does not have the right to do. So whether it does not have the right to do based on the principles of Islam or based on the principle of justice. Okay, jahiliyyah to also mean not knowing that something is harmful. So they would engage in certain practices and not really recognize that this is actually not in your favor, and that in the long run, right now you might think of it as it's basically serving you, and not recognizing that it's actually not in your favor. It's going to bring you in the long run. And that's where jahiliyyah could also mean the opposite of wisdom. And what is wisdom? Wisdom is actually وضع الشيء في موضعه. What does that mean? Wisdom means that it is putting something in where it belongs. How do you get wisdom? Well, you get wisdom with experience. And that's why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described in Surah An-Nisa, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala said, فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا فَدَفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُم. If you sense rushd, what is rushd? Rushd is basically maturity, is wisdom, but that doesn't happen not until the person develops basically the maturity in their brain, with experience. They recognize the consequences of things. So therefore, before things even happen, they would anticipate what's going to happen, and they would take the precautions, and they would make the right choices, probably 10 years and 20 years and 30 years probably before things would end up taking them into that destination. That's wisdom. So there's probably memorizing the Quran because they recognize that it's a lot easier to memorize the Quran when I'm young than getting older and probably having children, etc. So they would start memorizing the Quran from now and say, well, I'm going to anticipate that maybe 10 years, 20 years from now, I'm not going to have the same ability. So they would anticipate. Or get a job probably, or maybe get a college degree, etc. And they would anticipate before things happening what might happen, and they would make the choices before things actually take place and make the right decisions to avoid a wrong consequence. Okay, let's see. The other meaning of jahil or jahiliyyah is basically the idea or the impression that some of the hypocrites or the disbelievers would have about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, we're talking about it's not just an impression, but it's also their faith and what ideology that they would carry in regards to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The other jahiliyyah is worshipping different idols. So we're talking about paganism. We're talking about jahiliyyah also being a description to describe the era that preceded Islam, and jahiliyyah basically describing the morality of the disbelievers. Okay, just recognize these different areas in order for us to stay away from jahiliyyah. If we don't have the definition of jahiliyyah in place, then we could be living in it. And that's why it's important to take that moment and actually study it before we would embrace it without us recognizing. Okay, so what would actually bring jahiliyyah? Number one, you could say when it's a serious matter, but they're actually not taking it seriously. That would lead to jahiliyyah. That's why Prophet Musa alayhi salam, when Bani Israel, they said, قَالُوا أَتَتَّخِذُنَا هُزُوًا قَالَ أَعُوذُ بِاللَّهِ مِنْ أَكُونَ مِنَ الْجَاهِلِينَ. I want you to look at this one. This is extremely important because during our times, pranking and lacking seriousness and being a person that is continuously taking everything into sarcasm and joking about everything is actually seen as a person that is cool. And this is extremely dangerous because it can absorb us. It can take us into a completely different reality, in a different identity, in a different personality, because if we're continuously joking about everything and just laughing about everything, and without us realizing, it's going to be our character that is nothing but sakhif and safih. What is a sakhif and a safih? A sakhif is a person that doesn't take serious matters as serious. So what would they? They would be very trivial. That's a sakhif. A safih is a person that wanders energy and wanders valuable things. That's a safih. So it could be a valuable thing, whether it's time or whether it's probably maybe different potentials that they would have. Just different potentials, and then they would waste it. whether it's money put as a potential, whether it's intelligence as a potential, or whether it's probably a certain potential that they might have that others don't have, but then they would waste it. That's also jahl. The other thing is, when it comes to jahl, is letting emotions overcome mind. What are we talking about here? We're talking about an impulsive behavior. An impulsive behavior, a person just letting their own emotions and how they feel about matters control the choices and the judgment that they would make in regards to understanding the world around them. And this happens a lot with women, that we're feeling emotional about something and we would let our emotions basically determine what decisions we make and then end up going into the wrong area and then wondering why these things are happening to us. See, the other thing is that judging people based on wealth, social status, and not necessarily based on the principles and the morals and the moralities that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala had judged people based on. In other words, using the wrong standards, such as basically during our time, they would consider and they would tell you that sexual aberration, the LGBT, that it's basically a sexual orientation. It's basically using the wrong description and giving it a fancy name, that it's an orientation and not an aberration. They would give it a fancy name to make it seem like it's something that is smart. And then, of course, without us realizing, that would basically redirect their vision from reading things the way that they should be read and from understanding things based on their realities to having a delusion in the way they would understand the realities of matters. And that's jahiliyyah. Okay, so when we say jahiliyyah, whether we're speaking about the vision and how we describe certain things, the labeling, the practice, or the classification of things, all of that could also be jahiliyyah. So making that, let's say, clear that when we're speaking about jahiliyyah, if it is following one, speculation, or it's following our own feelings and not following al-wahy, that's when we would recognize that the person is following jahiliyyah. So the word jahiliyyah is a very important word that we understand, and all those different key elements that we had explained, because the Prophet ﷺ had basically come in order to protect us from the different jahiliyahs out there. So that one, inshallah, that one was basically what I wanted to focus on in today's class. The word jahiliyah right there, and also fear. Okay, so inshallah tomorrow we're going to put these together and we're going to get into Tafseer al-Qurtubi and basically get al-Qurtubi to explain to us the different circumstances that surrounded basically this tafsir for that ayah. Okay, so if there are any questions, I'd be happy to answer them, inshallah. No questions? Okay. And if you would like, I'll turn off the recording just to give the free space for those that